for joining me again today for another in our series of interviews with really inspirational women doing incredible work across all aspects of the built environment. And today I'm joined by Alyson Prince. Alyson is really extraordinary. She is unique, one of a kind. She is a built environment infection control nurse, currently working out of Great Ormond Street. And there is nobody else who has exactly that role. So thank you so much for joining us today, Alyson.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really curious to know, I mean, we'll come on and find out later about why it is you are one of a kind. But let's start with the question to understand a bit more about actually what it is that you do. Tell me about your job.
So I work within the built environment team, capital and estates, but I also work with one foot in the infection control team. So I bring the clinical infection control risk assessments into the built environment with things like ventilation, water hygiene, but also clinical layout, design, planning, and advise around the infection control risks associated with such things in projects throughout the project, from concept through to completion, to handover, post handover. So the whole stage of the project gets an infection control input from beginning to end, and consistency is something that improves the quality of the projects that we come out with, but also makes it safer for the patients.
Of course, of course. And you've been doing this for what, over 10 years, I believe?
Yeah, since 2011, there was a new role created at UCH, which is where I started, and I worked again across the sections of both divisions, providing that clinical input, but also that communication between the two teams to enable proper risk assessment to be completed. As no engineer is a clinician and no clinician is an engineer, but it's me as somebody who has that background and understands the engineering concepts that and has a qualification that will provide that input and that link between the two.
So I have to ask, Alyson, why is it, especially given our awareness now of concerns around viruses and infection and the spread of infection in workplace and elsewhere, why on earth is it that you are the only one of your kind in the UK? And actually, more importantly, what do we do about that? So there's two questions in one.
Yeah, so thinking about it, I think the reason why is because it's not part of what we as infection control nurses are taught. Even microbiologists and infection control doctors do not get standard building information taught to them as part of their development. As part of, we do public health and epidemiology, we do surveillance, we do all different bits, but we don't do the built environment. And I think then that means that what happens is in practice is people have to learn on the hoof. And then the result of that is that there is no standardization of education, and therefore no standardization of knowledge across the board. So you'll find some infection control nurses that are really good about the built environment and really understand it because they've had lots of experience, and there's some that have no idea whatsoever, but still are expected to do the same things in terms of sign off projects and review commissioner reports and all of that sort of thing. And that to me says and suggests, in answer to the second part of your question, is that we need a standardized teaching from the core, from the beginning. The minute somebody decides that they want to be an infection control nurse, and we have to do an infection control degree, that should be a key core part of what we have to do. We should learn about the built environment and the impact on infection and how infection is spread within the environment. We learn a little bit around transmission of infection and how it happens via aerosol, and you've heard lots of aerosol and droplet being discussed within the media, but actually it's about how that impacts that risk assessment, that critical risk assessment, on how that impacts on the space and how the space is used. That means that from an infection control point of view, you can give that risk assessment to the people who need it. So it's education from the beginning and standardized education from the beginning. So all key parts of the topic are taught to all infection control nurses, so we all come out with the same level of knowledge. And then we can choose which area we specialize in.
Given everything that you know, what is it that keeps you awake at night?
think outside of healthcare, there is less consistency in guidance and knowledge around risk assessing the reintroduction of the public back into public spaces. I think that lack of consistency is what worries me. The fact that guidance is very difficult to interpret from both ends without having that connection of somebody like myself who can say, you know, not just from an air point of view, but from a water risk assessment point of view, you know, buildings that will have been left stagnating for time where there's, you know, no one in them, all of those types of things. And then that risk of public health that is posed to the public from being within that space. You know, we're not in hospital space, but equally we still have a public duty to protect people, and some of the Health and Safety Work Act sort of things. But it's how do they risk assess that COVID risk without that discussion? It worries me greatly. I am really concerned about it.
And it's public buildings in particular.
Yeah, things like sports venues, leisure centres, libraries, you know, all of the public spaces that people will be in when things start opening up. It is a real anxiety for me, because I've tied the two together in terms of I know how the organisms behave, but I also understand how the building works. And it's that sort of connection that means that I can put the two together and see where the problems may occur if not assessed properly and thoroughly. Yeah,
and of course we're now, of course, thinking about coming back to offices again. You know, the restrictions on us all are starting to lift. So I must ask you that question, sort of, and I feel it myself as an employer. What advice would you give to anybody in terms of helping to maintain, you know, infection control in our offices and our built environment at the moment?
I think we have to go back to what the government have been saying, and it is advised by the science in terms of you know, space and place, and thinking about what we do. From our organisation, we're already having the conversations about who can come back and how many where. But I think, you know, until we sort of see out what the winter this year does for infections, we need to kind of be cautious. And so therefore an office which would have had 20 people might now have 10, but they do it on a rotational basis, so they can still maintain the distance between each other and being socially distanced, and then cleaning down our workspaces and all of the sort of measures that we've already been doing to maintain that gap, which I think until we see where we go from this winter and this season, I think it's important. And obviously vaccinations will have a knock-on effect and reduce down the numbers. But again, it's about that won't be zero. So how much risk we want to take. And I think the measures of social distancing and hand hygiene and cleaning your workspace will be key in order to maintain a safe workspace for any worker. And it's about thinking about the sizes of space and looking around your area and seeing what the risks are, you know, in terms of breaks and all of those things that we would normally discuss and have been discussing for the last year or so, and having those and bringing those together for how we best work in our environment and in our company, because it'll be different between everyone.
So it's more of the same, really. More of the same, common sense, keep going. Yeah. And still some, you know, as you said, probably need to get over this winter before we can really see how things are going to pan out. Yeah. It's not forever, but it's for a little while longer. Yeah. Alyson, thank you so much. We could be talking so much more. Certainly the things that you've told me about infection control and the complexities in the built environment are worthy of many, many more discussions. So maybe we can have another one another day, but thank you for now. That was really, really great. Thank you for having me. Thanks for listening. Being unique, it's always nice for someone to listen. And where do we find out more, by the way, if we want to know more about built environment infection control? I mean, there's lots of journal articles around the science of it, but for the practical experiences, I think you'd have to talk to me. Right, well, we'll make sure your contact details are on the website. Thank you, Alyson. All right then, thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.